are living in food-insecure households. 1 in 3 Canadians are now borrowing money just to afford groceries.
What you just watched is a real debate happening inside the Canadian Parliament right now in 2026. And the numbers being argued over, they are not statistics from some far-off developing country. They are from Canada, one of the wealthiest nations on planet Earth, a G7 country, a country sitting on some of the world's largest natural resources. And yet, nearly 10 million Canadians cannot reliably afford food. My name is Your Name, and today I am going to walk you through what is really happening inside Canada's economy. The real data, the real debates, and the real consequences for millions of ordinary people. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand why this matters, not just for Canadians, but for every Western country watching the same patterns unfold. Let's start with the data, because numbers don't lie, even when politicians try to spin them. According to Statistics Canada's most recent Canadian Income Survey, released in April 2026, approximately 9.8 million people in Canada, including 2.4 million children, are living in food-insecure households. That is roughly 1 in every 4 Canadians. Let that sink in. 1 in 4. These are not people living in poverty in the traditional sense. Many of them are working. Many of them are employed full-time, but they are still struggling, genuinely struggling, to put enough food on the table for their families. Now, what exactly does food insecure mean? It does not just mean skipping a meal once in a while. Statistics Canada uses a very specific, very rigorous measurement called the Household Food Security Survey Module. 18 detailed questions about whether households are experiencing things like worrying about running out of food before they have money to buy more, being unable to afford balanced meals, cutting portion sizes or skipping meals, and in severe cases, going entire days without eating because there is simply no money. This is Canada in 2026. And nearly a quarter of the entire population is experiencing this. Now, here is where it gets even more striking. This is not a new trend. Food insecurity has been climbing steadily. In 2018, around 13% of Canadians were food insecure. By 2022, that number had jumped to nearly 17%. By 2024, it hit a record of 25.5%. And while 2025 shows a very slight decline to 24%, researchers at Proof, the University of Toronto's Food Insecurity Monitoring Program, are clear. These numbers remain among the highest ever recorded in over 2 decades of tracking. The progress is minimal. The crisis is structural. And perhaps the most heartbreaking dimension of this crisis involves children. Nearly 30.8% of children under 18 in Canada, almost 1 in 3, lived in a food-insecure household in 2025. That represents approximately 2.4 million children. Children who are going to school hungry. Children whose development, focus, and long-term health outcomes are being affected right now. The data on racial and Indigenous disparities makes the picture even more complex. According to Right to Food, a national advocacy organization, 34.7% of Indigenous peoples in Canada are living in food-insecure households. For Black Canadians, that number climbs to 41%. These are not abstractions. These are real families in every province making impossible choices every single day. Now let's talk about food banks, because the food bank data is perhaps the clearest, most visceral proof of how severe this situation has become. Food Banks Canada, the national organization coordinating over 5,500 food programs, releases an annual report called Hunger Count. And the 2025 Hunger Count report contains a number that stopped researchers in their tracks. In March 2025 alone, in a single month, there were nearly 2.2 million visits to food banks across Canada. That is the highest number ever recorded in Canadian history. To put that in perspective, it took Canada decades to reach 1 million visits per month. It then took just 5 years to double that. The Food Banks Canada CEO, Kirsten Beardsley, said, and I'm quoting her directly, that it took decades to reach 1 million visits in a month, and it has now taken half a decade to double that. She is calling this a breaking point. She is using the words, Canada cannot afford to normalize hunger. Think about that phrase, normalizing hunger. In a country with a TATTOA credit rating, in a country that just spent $67 billion more than it collected in taxes in a single year. And who is showing up to these food banks? It is no longer just the chronically unemployed or people on social assistance. According to the Hunger Count data, 19% of food bank clients in 2025 list employment as their main source of income. They are working people. That is up from just 12% in 2019. Nearly 1 in 5 people visiting a food bank has a job. They are just not earning enough to survive. 1 in 3 food bank visitors is a child. Nearly half of all clients are families with kids. Now here is where the debate gets heated and, frankly, complicated, because the Canadian government's response to all of this has been spend more. The 2026 Spring Economic Update, tabled in the House of Commons just weeks ago, projected that the federal deficit for fiscal year 2025-2026 came in at approximately $66.9 billion. The government celebrated this because it was actually $11.5 billion lower than the $78.3 billion that had been forecast in Budget 2025. But here is what the celebration leaves out. The last budget under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau projected a deficit of $31 billion for this year. The actual deficit is more than double that, and the government is projecting deficits continuing for years, narrowing slowly, but never actually reaching balance within the current fiscal horizon. Since 2015, Canada's federal debt has nearly doubled, surging from roughly $0.9 trillion to over $1.7 trillion. And economists are now projecting that by 2030, Canada could owe $1.5 trillion in federal debt alone, including all levels of government, federal, provincial, and territorial. Canada's aggregate debt has reached extraordinary levels. The interest payments alone are staggering. Debt servicing costs, just the interest Canada pays on money it has already borrowed, are estimated at $54 billion this fiscal year. That is projected to rise to $80.9 billion by 2030-31. The Parliament debate you saw at the start of this video made a striking claim. Canada now spends more on debt interest than it does on healthcare. I want to be clear. That comparison depends on how you slice the numbers. But what is unambiguously true is that debt servicing is now one of the fastest growing line items in the entire federal budget. It grew 116% in the last decade. And it is not just government debt. It is household debt, the debt that ordinary Canadians carry personally. According to analysis of International Monetary Fund data, Canadian household debt has now reached 103% of GDP. That means Canadian households collectively owe more than the entire value of everything Canada's economy produces in a year. Among G7 nations, the world's most advanced economies, Canada's household debt burden is the worst. For comparison, American households carry debt equal to 71% of GDP, British households 81%. The average across 34 OECD countries is 58%. Canada is nearly double the average. This means that when Canadians are struggling to buy groceries, many of them are reaching for credit cards or lines of credit. They are borrowing to survive, and that borrowing compounds the problem because debt has interest. And when you are already stretched thin, interest is another bill you cannot pay. 1 in 3 Canadians, per data cited in parliamentary debate, are now borrowing money just to afford basic necessities like groceries. This is not a minor financial inconvenience. This is a structural failure. Now, to be balanced, and I always want to be balanced with you, the government does point to real programs. The Canada Child Benefit has delivered meaningful relief to families with children. Research does show it reduced severe food insecurity in certain demographics. The government recently introduced a Canada Groceries and Essentials benefit, essentially an enhanced GST credit worth an estimated $11.7 billion over 6 years, designed to put more money in the pockets of low and moderate income Canadians. Canada's inflation rate has returned to near the Bank of Canada's 2% target. The IMF has recognized Canada as having the strongest fiscal position in the G7, based on the government's net debt to GDP ratio. GDP growth for Q1 2026 is projected at 1.7% annualized. Manufacturing saw its largest monthly growth in 3 years. These are real data points. They matter. But here is the tension. Macroeconomic indicators and household reality are two different things. GDP growth averaged across the entire economy does not tell you whether the family in Renfrew County, as reported by the Globe and Mail just recently, is surviving on $40 a month for food after paying all other expenses. It does not tell you whether the single parent in Calgary can find a daycare spot for her infant, given that Canada's childcare waitlists have in some regions now exceeded the age at which children even need daycare before parents return to work. The 10-a-day childcare program was celebrated as transformative, and its intentions were genuine. But Statistics Canada's own data shows that in 2025, 31% of parents not using childcare reported their child was on a wait list, up from 26% previously. For infants under 1 year old, that waitlist rate hit 56% in some regions. The program lowered prices, but it did not build enough new spots. The result, families priced into a market that does not have room for them. Price controls that expand demand without matching supply do not solve affordability. They often worsen it in practice. So what is actually driving this? Economists and researchers across the political spectrum are pointing to several structural issues that no single program has yet resolved. First, housing costs. Canada's housing crisis is directly connected to food insecurity. When rent consumes 60%, 70%, even 80% of a person's income, food becomes optional. The Globe and Mail has documented the direct link. When food bank visits go up, homelessness follows. They are symptoms of the same disease. Second, wage stagnation. Canada's GDP per capita has grown just 2% since 2015, but debt per capita has surged 62% in the same period. Ordinary Canadians are producing more value collectively, but that value is not reaching them. Third, food price inflation. The 2026 Canada Food Price Report, produced by 4 major Canadian universities, projects food prices will rise a further 4 to 6% this year alone. Food prices have increased by approximately 32% since 2021. That is not gradual. That is a sustained compounding crisis in the most essential category of household spending. Fourth, the immigration and population growth dynamic. Canada added population rapidly in recent years. More people means more demand for housing, food, and services. Infrastructure and supply did not keep pace. Per capita metrics, income, housing, social services declined even as national totals grew. This is not about blaming newcomers. It is about policy that scaled population without scaling capacity. The Canada Food Price Report's annual family food bill for a family of 4 is now projected at $17,570 for 2026, nearly $1,000 more than in 2025. In a country where median household incomes are not growing fast enough to match this, that gap gets filled with debt, food banks, or both. Right to Food, a national organization working with 450 partner agencies across Canada, is calling for something specific, an acknowledgement that food insecurity is an income problem, not a charity problem. People are not food insecure because they lack knowledge or ingenuity, the organization states. They are food insecure because of inadequate incomes and poor policy choices. That framing cuts across the partisan debate. Whether you believe the solution is lower taxes and economic growth or stronger social programs and income supports, almost every serious analyst agrees that patching symptoms without addressing the underlying cost of living mathematics is not sustainable. Food banks were designed as emergency relief, a temporary safety net for a temporary problem. They have now become a permanent infrastructure for millions of Canadians. Food Banks Canada says clearly, we are reaching a breaking point. Charity alone cannot solve a crisis this deep. The federal government's response, a groceries benefit, a fuel tax suspension, more childcare spending, is not without merit. But the critics are asking whether layering new spending on top of a $67 billion deficit in a country where household debt is already at 103% of GDP and where debt servicing costs are rising toward $80 billion per year creates a foundation for genuine recovery or simply delays a reckoning. Here is the bottom line. Nearly 10 million Canadians cannot reliably afford food. 2.2 million are visiting food banks in a single month, double what it was 6 years ago. A third of those visiting food banks are children. Canada's federal government ran a $66.9 billion deficit this past year. Canada's total aggregate debt, government, household, and corporate combined, has reached 377% of GDP, making it one of the most indebted nations among advanced economies. The debate you watched at the start of this video, the MPs arguing in Parliament, is not abstract theater. It reflects a real unresolved crisis over what kind of country Canada wants to be and whether the tools being used are actually working. What is clear, beyond all political spin in both directions, is that the current trajectory is not sustainable, and the people paying the price are not politicians. They are not economists. They are parents skipping meals so their kids can eat. They are workers with jobs who still cannot afford groceries. They are children, 2.4 million of them, growing up food insecure in one of the wealthiest countries in human history. That is the story of Canada in 2026. If you found this video valuable, please subscribe and share it. These are the conversations that need to be heard, not just in Canada, but across every Western nation watching the same patterns develop. I will see you in the next one.